So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about cystic fibrosis and also share with you some of my holiday pictures. When you arrived here today, you should have been given a straw. So I'd like you to take those straws out, if you will. And I'd like you to put them in your mouths. And I'd like you to try and breathe through them. We're not going to do this for too long, but if you could try and breathe through them for the next 30 to 40 seconds. Essentially, that's what it feels like if you have one of the more severe forms of cystic fibrosis. It basically attacks the body's organs, especially the lungs, until you need a lung transplant or worse. And the average life expectancy for someone with cystic fibrosis is about 40 years. As someone that's recently turned 40, I'm hoping that it gets revised upwards fairly soon. But hopefully, you know, the experience that you've got in terms of just breathing through those straws gives you an indication of how hard that is. Imagine running like that, imagine going up the stairs like that, imagine doing any activity like that. You can take the straws out of your mouth now. I consider myself extremely lucky because apart from a couple of near-death experiences as a child, I have a milder form of CF and I've had a very lucky life. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. This represents my first camping experience. I was about 5 years old and admitted to hospital. Luckily, at that age, I didn't realise that seeing priests on the other side wasn't necessarily the best omen. I had a reasonably good life from that point on in terms of it was relatively balanced until I was 13 when I was admitted to hospital with 3 types of pneumonia. And it was at that point the doctors started to ask what was going on. And it was then that they diagnosed me with cystic fibrosis. The life expectancy then was a further 5 years, and the only benefit that I could see was the 3 months that I managed to get off school at the time. But essentially, from that point on, they managed to give me medication that kept me relatively balanced compared to most people with cystic fibrosis. So I had regular hospital visits. There are times when I've woken up in the middle of the night gurgling blood, which is a particularly horrific experience. You wonder when it's going to stop. You get lots of infections, and you really need to take lots of different medications like IVs, nebulizers to try and manage that. I went fine through school, got through university, lucky enough to get a job in a global consultancy, and I've had a reasonably good career. The thing that really irritated me about cystic fibrosis was the external symptoms. So if I was coming to talk to a group of people like this, or I'm at a board meeting or seeing a new client, then essentially, you know, there'd be times when I'd be coughing so much and I wouldn't know when I'm going to stop, so I'd have to leave the room. In a boardroom situation, I'd recommend you always sit next to the person that you dislike the most. But essentially, you'd have people looking at you wondering, what the hell's he got? Am I going to get it? You know, I certainly don't want to have whatever it is that he's got. And so I didn't mind the hospitals, I didn't mind the treatments. It was really that external perception that I disliked the most. Dating was always an interesting experience. Apparently, coughing up half a lung over a romantic candlelit dinner is not particularly good dating etiquette. Some girls can be a little bit fussy like that. But I wouldn't want you to think that having cystic fibrosis is all doom and gloom. There are some positives to it. So it gives you great abs. The coughing really gives you a workout. I can't recommend that enough. And one girlfriend said to me at the time, she said, you know, it's great having a boyfriend with cystic fibrosis because you know when you lose someone at a party or you lose someone in the supermarket, you don't know where they are. She said, when you've got a boyfriend with cystic fibrosis, you just follow the coughs. She said, having a boyfriend with cystic fibrosis is like having a cat with a bell. You always know where they are. Like for many middle-aged men, drugs were a life-changing experience for me. And I was a bit skeptical when they came out. I used to be a guinea pig on various drugs trials, and one I remember I had a 30% drop in lung function, which was kind of the opposite effect to that which was desired. And so when these came out, I was a bit unsure. But it was amazing. Within 24 hours, I felt an impact. My lungs started to clear of mucus. Within a week, my lungs were much clearer, not much coughing. My exercise times week after week would decrease, and they just get better and better. And so the best thing I can say about this drug, which changes things at a molecular level as a treatment and is really revolutionary, is that it made me feel normal. And I've stood in a room like this with the scientists that created this and asked them this question. You create a miracle drug. It helps 4% of people with cystic fibrosis. Why would you create it in the form of a small blue pill with a V on the side? Frankly, having a container full of Viagra-like drugs on your bedside table just leads to completely tiring and unrealistic consequences. From that point on, I could no longer take part in drugs trials in the same way that I had done previously. And so I was thinking, okay, well, how else can I help the charity side of things? Because I used to prefer to do something discreetly as opposed to overtly. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to combine my mountaineering experience and try and do something that way. This is to show you it's the 6th highest mountain in the world. It takes a huge amount of training to do something like that. It takes about 6 months from a good base. And you do things like you'll run up and down hills or stairs for 5 hours at a time. You'll go to the Alps. For fun, you'll carry up to 26 kilos on your ankles and back when you're doing that. You get a break about every 30 seconds when you're doing that training because you need to take on some fluids, you need to take on some energy because you're trying to actually increase weight and you have protein straight after that. The only benefits from the weight gaining point of view is you have that protein, but I'd also eat as much chocolate as I wanted because frankly, if I'm putting on muscle or fat, that's good news because I know when I get to the mountain, I can't absorb enough calories. So there's extreme preparation like that. And because I have a low lung capacity, it was always important for me to try and be fitter than anyone else on the mountain to try and compensate for that deficit. From a CF point of view, I had to take various medications and I also had to develop things like coughing techniques because I learnt early on at altitude when you're coughing a lot, particularly when the oxygen levels might be equivalent to a third of what they are here, you can really irritate your lungs. I ripped the side of my lung at one point and that was about 13, 14 years ago, and so you have to develop techniques and things to deal with it. But anyway, so I'd done the 6th highest mountain in the world and I thought, okay, I told 4 people about that. Maybe I can do some fundraising and profile raising. So how can I do that? I thought, okay, I'm going to try for Everest. It's not completely unrealistic, but and so I'm going to give it a go. And I started out on this journey in 2014, and the aim was to raise profile and money for CF charities. Profile because I believe the more people that understand what CF is, the more people will give to it. And in 2014, I set out and we got to base camp, no issues. And then there was the worst tragedy ever that had happened on Everest. And that was when some Sherpa died in the icefall, where there was a broken ladder and typically you'd turn around and go back. That didn't happen, human complacency. And the route was in a particularly dangerous part. And so no one summited that year. And the route was changed from those years on. And the attitude, mentality was changed. And so I thought, okay, I'm willing to go back and give it another go. So I went back in 2015, because obviously lightning can't strike twice, can it? And if you've seen the Everest movie, these are the bridges that you see when you're flying up in the helicopter. That's the first view of Everest you get on the left. We had little yaks and things join us at various points. And then that's Everest Base Camp. And essentially, what you see there is the icefall, which is a continuously moving pieces of ice going essentially down a very steep hill. To give you a sense of scale, you can't see it very clearly on this, but essentially these are people there. And so it's a huge challenge to actually get through this. You have very interesting points such as this, where you're crossing crevasses. It gets particularly interesting when you're looking down a few hundred meters. And for me, this is mentally the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. And you're on this wobbly ladder and you get your crampon stuck between two of the rungs. And you know you're going to have to use brute force to remove your crampon. But if you use too much brute force, you're going to end up in the crevasse, which is not particularly conducive to success. And so essentially you've got challenges like that. Some of the crevasses are small, you jump over. Although I remember one looked a little bit too big to jump over. Snow bridge, footprints, okay, I'll take the snow bridge. Put my feet on the snow bridge and it collapsed underneath me. And I remember shoving my fists forward and my feet backwards and basically turning myself into a bridge and then hauling myself out. So you have the joys of that sort of thing. So 2015, we got to Camp 1. You go up and down the mountain to try and generate more and more red blood cells to help transport the oxygen to your muscles, which is missing because of the lower amount of oxygen at those altitudes. We got back down to base camp, had a rest. We were going to go up to Camp 1 and then Camp 2 again. And this essentially happened. This is from the outskirts. So that was from the outskirts. I was in the main blast. I didn't take out my camera and start to film it. I got out of my tent. I was wearing one single layer of clothing, no shoes, anything like that. I saw a 300-meter wall of snow and ice that came from the earthquake shaking part of the glacier off the mountain, basically coming towards me. It turned out it had been like a bomb blast. It was coming towards me about 200 miles an hour. And so I did the thing that most sane people do, which was to leg it to lower ground to try and minimize the impact. And obviously I couldn't outrun it, but it caught up with me, smashed me to the ground. I got up because I was concerned about drowning. It smashed me to the ground again. I got up, and then it started to settle. And I helped one of my friends that had a broken leg onto some matting, and then I realized I was starting to show signs of hypothermia. So I thought I'll go back to my tent, get in a sleeping bag, put equipment on, but it's all gone. So actually, my part of camp was completely gone. So you'd have had ice axes, tents, things like that, flying through the air, and we found them in a radius of about 500 meters. So I'm there, I'm dripping with blood, I've got dirt all over me, and I'm thinking, okay, well, what do I do? And so I basically go and scavenge. I go and look for whatever I can find. And there's one of my teammates who's about this high, who was out of camp at the time, and I managed to find his down suit, which is what you use to go to the summit. Unfortunately, it comes down to about my elbows and my knees, and so it looked a bit ridiculous, but it did start to warm my core. And then other teammates that had managed to take shelter came and helped, and I got them to find some sleeping bags, and I managed to stabilize over the next few hours. I had broken ribs, I had fluid gathering on one of my lungs, which meant you have to constantly cough because there's a risk of pneumonia otherwise, which is the last thing you want to do when you've got broken ribs. But essentially, we waited out that night because there's snowing, you couldn't get helicopters up. And then the next day, managed to fly down, then get another helicopter fly down. Eventually ended up in Kathmandu, where there was supposed to be a medic. No medic there. So I was stuck there, covered in dirt and blood, no money, no cards, nothing, because it's all somewhere on the mountain scattered. So I had to persuade a taxi driver that I didn't know to take me to a hotel I had no reservation at, and convince him that that hotel would pay him for the taxi fare. Thankfully, I managed to find a taxi driver that was willing to do that, and the hotel did pay him. And I remember calling up my parents. I was 39 years of age, never done this before, and saying, "Mum, Dad, I need some money." Never thought that would happen, but it did. Anyway, they were happy to help. What would you do? Would you go for it again after that experience? You lot are far more intelligent and wise than I am. So I thought, okay, for me, in the same way that I'd go and lie on a beach in Thailand, despite the fact there's been a tsunami, the chance of a massive earthquake on this scale is unlikely to happen again in the immediate future. So the danger element, whilst it's dangerous on Everest, hadn't actually increased, despite the fact this was the worst ever disaster on it. The only silver lining from it that I could take was the media profile. I talked about the profile that I was talking that helps in terms of the charity. And my only rule with journalists is that as long as they mention the charities, be they US or UK, then I'm happy to talk to them. And it's amazing how many people will help you and come forward and help you. So we got reasonable profile last year and also this year. Met various people. I didn't share my theories on the origins of the universe with Stephen. I polluted Times Square for a few days earlier this year, but got a reasonable amount of profile. Then we went back, and this is again in the icefall. It's a bit more fragmented because of the earthquake essentially shook and broke it up. But it gives you a small idea of some of the things you're having to contend with. Often we'd be climbing at 2 or 3 in the morning. You hear snow dropping beneath you, ice dropping beneath you. You get new crevasses opening up. It's a pretty dangerous place. But you get through that. This is Camp 1. We then went up and down the mountain, leaving stores and supplies to acclimatise. It takes about 2 months in total. This is Camp 2. This is something called the Lhotse Face. And essentially, you climb up over here, and you camp about 2/3 of the way up. That's what the camp looks like nearer the top. This is the view from there, which is pretty special. And then when you get there and you've stayed there and you've gone up again, it's a really interesting time because the first time you can think about possibly going to the summit because you know you finally have a chance. So we climbed up to Camp 4, which is at 7,900 meters, so the start of the death zone. And you get a few hours rest before you have to set off. And we were due to set off at 9 o'clock that night. And then a storm came up. So we delayed it for an hour or so, decided to set off anyway. There were high winds, but it seemed manageable. We had to break trail, and we were in full equipment. This is the sort of equipment that you have to wear. My friends tell me very kindly that's my best face pick, so I've started to use that on LinkedIn and dating profiles. we'll see how it goes. But essentially, so we started to move up the mountain, break trail, and when we got to the somewhere called the South Summit, the storm really started to close in, a bit like in the Everest film. And so we decided at that point we were going to turn around. And in my head, I accepted we were going to turn around. It took me 3 attempts to climb the 6th highest mountain, so I'm risk averse. But essentially, I was thinking in my head, wow, all that training, it takes over your life. And am I going to come back a 4th time? Will I get a chance to go back up from base camp when you bear in mind your muscles are wasting every time you're going up the mountain? And so all these things were going through my head. And luckily, it subsided a bit and cleared. And we decided, okay, let's carry on. And myself and a Sherpa friend carried on ahead of the group. And then my oxygen went. And to use a technical term, we bashed the tubes around a bit. And thankfully, it got working again. But each time I was thinking, okay, you know, is this going to be my last attempt? Is this going to be my last trial? And eventually, this happened. So that's the top of the world. I wish they made these easier to unravel. But I had about 15 minutes up there by myself with a Sherpa friend, and then we had another 15 minutes when the rest of the team got there. That's me having about 60 seconds without my oxygen mask on, because otherwise you're unrecognisable, and so in order to get profile. And we've raised a 6-figure sum for the charities, which is quite good, and we're looking at ways to carry on doing that. But for me, one of the motivations when I'm climbing these mountains with a more limited lung capacity than some people, and still very lucky, every footstep is really difficult. Every breath is really difficult. You're taking a few breaths for every footstep. It's really painstaking. But for me, I keep thinking, well, this is only temporary. This is only for a couple of months. Whereas there are lots of people with cystic fibrosis who actually this is an everyday experience, that struggle. And the next slide is pretty brutal. But on the left, you've got a healthy pair of lungs. On the right, you've got an unhealthy pair of lungs. That's literally how the lungs degrade. And that's what most people face. But we're also in a time of great hope. We've had the first breakthroughs ever. And there are more. I'm convinced we have the scientific capabilities out there to actually crack this disease, whether it's medication or cure. But the one thing that is missing is funding, because the big pharmaceuticals don't invest in this. The charities have to prove the concept from a research point of view before there will be investment from the pharmaceutical companies. Governments don't invest much in it, despite the fact that 1 in 25 people is a carrier, 10,000 people in the UK, 30,000 in the US with it. People don't. So there's a huge amount of hope, but also when you consider the amount of people that are alive today, this is a real, genuine race against time for people that are alive today whose lungs are slowly degrading and other organs are slowly degrading. Go back to remembering what it's like breathing through that straw. That's some people's daily life. And really, it's up to us as to whether we do anything about it. So it's a genuine race against time for people that are alive today. If any of you want to get involved and help in any way, please get in touch. But thank you for your time.